My role here is to bring everyone up to date on what is happening with the Trinity River project, and I will do that. But I thought I would start with a bit of a broader issue, perhaps. And that has to do with sort of not a quarrel, but a discussion that I have with my wife, Sylvia, from time to time between the difference between want and need. These are two words that are kind of aligned somehow. I'll say, I need to go there, I need to do this, and she says, but do you want to, or do you need to? And the title of this conference made me think of that, Gail, because what does the city want to do or be versus what it might need to do or be? And certainly in the context of the Trinity, the question is it want or is it need? So I will try to more or less advance that discussion and debate so that it's not all about the Parkway. I start with a vision of the world because sometimes we cannot ask of the world what it wants to be, but a little planet what it needs to be. And the last person to really have a significant say about this question of need versus want was Ian McHarg, who is, for those of you who may not know, one of the seminal figures in landscape architecture and planning, because he introduced the concept of ecological thinking and planning and process in making cities. And so he was my mentor and teacher, and I joined his firm a long time ago, and I'm a principal there in that firm today, even though he's long departed. But one of the things he introduced was the concept of learning how to read a landscape and understand the landscape as a precursor to development. And it was kind of odd for me. I started writing a book 3 years ago. It was published earlier this year about his legacy in the context of current day issues of urbanization, as you've heard this morning. So it's a bit of a critique, I'm sorry to say, but nonetheless his work was truly gigantic. And as an example of what he did is the woodlands in Texas. He was one of the first ones that took this enormous tract of land north of Houston and look at the oak woodland that's there and created a method by which the hydrology of this great site could be protected, the woods protected, while you had development going on at the same time. And it was a wonderful thing because drainage, for example, was not piped. Drainage was overland flow, a bit of a green infrastructure way ahead of its time. And it became very prominent, and today it stands as a real success story of living close to this natural environment, all mixed in. And the problem with this, of course, is that it's 30 miles north of Houston. It required the funding of a highway, Highway 45, to get there, which is heavily congested. And so today, Houston is building a metro system, kind of a light rail like we have here, but it will stop short 10 miles of the woodland. So these folks in the woodland, 60-some thousand, I think it's more like 90,000 people today, huge community, are really tied to their cars to go anywhere. For the most part. And so this is where the idea of design with nature kind of took a turn that maybe was unexpected, but so much of the world that we live in is about this idea of getting out into the hinterland and having this American dream that depends on things like cars and so forth, as we've discussed today. It's interesting, for example, if you look at the maps of Houston Metro and Boston Metro, the difference between 1970 and 1992. You look at the population in Houston increased by 66%, its land area increased by 82%. Fairly small increase if you think about it. That's because Houston was always spread out. And so the infill that happened in a spread way. But issues of development and sustainability are not just in cities like Houston, which are sort of the Sun Belt, if you will. Boston is even worse than that because the population increased only 1% in those 22 years, and yet the land mass increased 48% in terms of urban design. That's not really a good formula. And we know today, there you see the difference between one pattern of development and the other. So it's been well documented that this is not a sustainable way to live in the world. It's not a good picture of the world, especially when you consider that much of the world, in fact, more than half the world, is an urban environment in terms of where people live. And if you ever want to sort of a wake-up call about the impact on society of such pattern, you can read that book by Howard Frumkin called Urban Sprawl and Public Health. I mean, it kind of very concisely talks about the problems of the lifestyle that this sprawl kind of engenders. But there are trends that are coming back the other way. These are, I'm not going to read them to you. You can look at them real quick. But in California, the statistics of people that want to live in urban areas, in cities, the preference for transit, the preference for tight urban communities, the kinds of things that we've talked about today, is becoming increasingly more so. And the percentage of people is up there into the 50, 60%, which bodes well for urban design, I think. But the fact is that's California. And the rest of the country, I think in Dallas, the statistics is like 20% of people want to live in this kind of tighter urban environments. That lives 80% that still have this preference for being out there in the pattern that I think was created since the Second World War. And so the subject of the book that I've written is really how do you make density not an alternative, but an environment of choice, meaning that the value provided by density to you personally, as a family, as an individual, in terms of amenity, in terms of health, in terms of an ability to enjoy the fruits of society, becomes so greater that really you'd rather do that than do anything else. And so I show this picture because it was done in 1981 by James Wines. And James Wines is a professor of architecture, artist, practitioner at Penn State University, and he had a firm called Sight. You may recall some of his more provocative works a long time ago, but this is his provocation in a way to say, look, you know, we cannot keep spreading out. We have to live on top of each other by one way or the other. And this is a way that you might try and marry this American dream with this idea of density. And so it's kind of a provocation about the kind of environment we might create, actually not looking like that, but you get the idea. So what does this have to do with the Trinity and Dallas? If you look at downtown Dallas, which is the dot there on the screen, and you look at the region, as the mayor was, I think you can all locate DFW there over to the upper left, and then, of course, Fort Worth is conveniently out of the picture for now. And, you know, in the 1950s, the city basically grew to about 5-6 miles out from the dot, and they created Loop 12, basically to circle the development. And Northwest Highway, for example, is part of that loop. Move another 20 years, and you get the LBJ freeway. That's another 4 or 5 miles out, and that development begins to sort of creep out even further. And then 20 years later, so we're talking about every 20 years, you grow another 5-6 miles, and then you get the turnpike, the Bush Turnpike, out there. And by then, of course, development is not symmetrical all the way around the dot. More development is happening to the north, so there's no highway to the south. So it's all up there, concentrated in the north side. I'm not showing the spokes, like Central and the toll road that connects these things like a bicycle kind of wheel. Interesting to note that in a study in the 1940s, Harlan Bartholomew, a respected planner, came to Dallas, did a master plan for the city, and thought that the small road that is Central Expressway today might be like a parkway. Does that sound familiar? Didn't happen, of course. But of course, the advent of DART began to sort of change the picture in very significant ways. And density began to sort of occur. whether it was West Village or Mockingbird Station down below, the idea that transit-oriented development can begin to occupy spaces and kind of fill in these gaps was important. But I will submit that if there was a project for the next 20 years, beginning with the 2000s, it is this kind of consolidation back towards the center. In other words, the ripple effect of those highways is beginning to sort of come back in. And we heard today about people that want to live in that kind of environment. I think it's going to be a need, not necessarily a want, as we move into the future. And within that score, the Trinity River Corridor is an absolute necessity, I would submit, for reasons that perhaps are obvious and maybe not so obvious. And so I will talk today about how this all came about and where we are today and what we might all do about it. So that's the view that you've seen before of the lakes and the park and so forth, about 2,000 acres worth in the context of downtown. It's a big project, but you're not alone. Cities in the country are competing with you for the same kind of environment, with the same kind of massive park, water-oriented infrastructure that can transform the cities to bring them back to the core. I think you know the work in Houston with Bayou that's been going on. I often wonder, what would have happened if the woodlands had never happened and those 90,000 people were living in downtown Houston today? The Bayou would be a reality today. But anyway, that did not happen. Certainly you know the project in Fort Worth, which is kind of maybe ahead of schedule, so you're in competition with Fort Worth. Regionally great, I think the mayor's right, you need two of them for this fourth great economy. The city of Phoenix did it by damming up the Rio Salado and putting up this a dam that can hold floodwaters and create a town lake, they call it. And you can see the effect of that, density pops up immediately. The Atlanta Beltline, maybe it's not a river, but it is a stream of sorts this is the railroad that encircles Atlanta. The railroad went away, and now it's planned as a greenway, including transit and connections to all of the parks around the city. And this is instigating massive redevelopment based on this one piece of green infrastructure. It's another, I think, close to $2 billion project. Washington, D.C. is being sort of reconstructed by virtue of focusing on the 5-mile corridor of the Anacostia River by bringing new development to the waters and creating new parks and things right on the shore. Water is a major theme in this quest to reinvent cities in their core areas. Water was the theme of James Pratt's wonderful book in 1992, Visions for Dallas Communities, which I think coincided with the sesquicentennial, correct me if I'm wrong, Gail, and Gail was a big part of that effort. And that's the project that began to introduce in major ways the idea that there should be water in the downtown, even though there was planned for other areas. And they referred to it as Dream Lake, which I think is kind of an interesting way to think about water. In fact, it was as a result of some of the conferences that Gail had about water that Ivan Illich came to town, talked about water, and created a book out of it, The Waters of Forgetfulness, if I recall, which talks about the Dallas situation. And he talks about the enchantment of water, thinking of water as anything that flows, as anything but something that flows in a pipe. So you can begin to get the picture of how this vision, to follow Gail's idea that you put your glasses and everything you see is through this lens, has been in the city for a very long time. I love this quote from that particular book that Gail talks about the dream of play and being silly and being foolish and tender and stroll and kiss. Somebody said, if you're not on top of this building, you cannot get a kiss and you quit. Well, this Trinity River will be the all-time attractor for kissing if it ever happens. And finally, she talks about the poem of Antonio Machado, I dreamed last night, oh marvelous error, that honeybees were in my heart, making honey out of my old failures, meaning you forget about a lot of things when you can think about water as part of the imagination, as part of the art of thinking. And that's a promise of it, for sure. The skyline of Dallas has been talked about, but there's one feature that is worth mentioning. Pegasus, you can see it in the little red spot rising on the skyline. Of course, it's been superseded by taller buildings. If you remember, the myth of Pegasus is that this horse struck the ground with such force that created a spring that came forth. And the muses, everything to do with beauty and poetry, came out of the ground and began to sort of infect the world with this kind of idea of a life that is about the spirit, the soul, beauty, poetry, art, and so forth. And that's what created Pegasus Plaza. And Brad, of course, is here, can talk more about it. I've been collaborating with Brad and Diana on the Trinity River project, and there you see the mark of the horse, the water that comes off the ground. But there's more to Pegasus than just that. Pegasus also was the carrier of thunderbolts to Zeus. Thunderbolts, of course, being the symbol of power and energy, which explains why Pegasus sits on top of what used to be the headquarters of Mobil Oil. So cars and power have been tied to Pegasus as well, which explains why we have a parkway to talk about in this city. In a way, coming from the outside, I see these two images of Pegasus, the muses and water on the inside, and perhaps the destructive power of energy, if used wrongly, on the other. And so when you talk about the character of Dallas, it's really about the soul. It's not about a personality trait. Which do you want to be? Which Pegasus do you want to be? You may recall that when, and I should preface this by saying that I've been involved with this project since 1998, when we were part of the half team that brought Calatrava into town. I may have something to do with that because I remember being in a meeting with some of the folks from Half Associates and my own office director here at the time, Donald Simpson. And we were thinking, as we were competing for the job to work for the mayor at that time on this plan, which was called the Master Implementation Plan for the Trinity, and we looked at this plan that already was on the table. You know, the parkway was going to come in on the one end and exit on the other, but split the floodway. It was going to be on both sides, northbound on the downtown side and southbound on the Oak Cliff side. And we look at this and say, my goodness, there will be two new bridges here, one at the top and one at the bottom. And we said, so why don't we bring someone that can really make a difference in terms of bridge design? And at the time, of course, that person was Santiago Calatrava. And he had never designed bridges for cars up to that point. His most famous bridge was the one in Sevilla for the World's Fair, which, you know, nice as it is, but pedestrian bridge. And so I remember being in a meeting when Santiago came to town to unveil the design for these two bridges and shows up with this. It was a box maybe 6 or 7 feet long and very flat like this, and maybe 2 or 3 feet wide, cardboard. And he'd just come from Switzerland with this thing, I guess. And we were all puzzled because we figured, well, how can there be a bridge inside that thing? I mean, maybe it's lying flat on its side and he's going to stand it up and create some magic by bringing it out. And what came out was this. Literally, it was a model of the city, the downtown, not with 2 bridges, but with 5 bridges. And he basically gave this impassioned talk about the value of bridges and water on cities. And he talked about Paris, and he talked about other cities. And clearly, he had this vision that the Trinity corridor needed to be a master work of urban design. Of course, he was right in the sense that bridges and water do go together very well. But he was wrong in another aspect, which is that, and by the way, this was the plan that came out of that effort, which had this very large lake in the middle, flanked by the highways. But it provided that sense of master urban stroke of creating a reflection of the skyline and these bridges, 5 new bridges in the city. But of course, forgotten in this mixture was ecology, was what the river means in people's minds. And how do you restore something that's been lost in the context of an environment? The river became channelized, and this is what caused Laura Miller to say no. And I think, Gail, you were part of that effort as well, to say, no, we need lakes that provide a sense of memory of that landscape, that bring back the river in a better form than it was before. And so that begat the Balanced Vision Plan. And that begat the work that then we again engaged, this time with CH2M Hill, to implement the Balanced Vision Plan from a technical perspective. And you can see that the lakes are still there, more or less in the same fashion as they were in the Balanced Vision Plan. The river and its meanders and the wetlands and its ecology are all in that place. And this is what you've seen before, the West Dallas Lake, the natural lake, and the urban lake. So the question now, we've been through that, is, okay, so the city is poised to start digging some holes, putting some lakes down. Can you implement this vision? And this is the effort that I will talk about now, to tell you how we can begin to create a sense of progress that's tangible and real in the landscape. You can do a fair amount of this right now. Thank you, Nelson, again, for facilitating an airplane that took me up to take this photograph. That's Nelson Spencer. And this is the area that is basically the focus of what we can do now. You're looking at the I-30 bridge. On the right side, you can see some of the construction equipment there in the floodway. It's advanced more than it is there today, of course. This picture was taken about 4 months ago. And then you can see Margaret Hunt Hill and the Continental Bridge right next to it as they exist today. The idea that we began to work on was to figure out a way to make individual lakes or holes filled with water as one, so you can begin to approach the idea of a bigger lake. And also, don't forget that there's stuff we can do on the Oak Cliff side, so it's not just about the downtown side, meaning how do we cross the river as being, as the pastor said today, from a wall to a bridge between the two sides. Constraints are significant in the sense that we cannot get too close to the existing bridges because there's no funds to rebuild the foundations of these bridges to put forth a continuous body of water between them, and we have to stay away from the river so as to not weaken the gap between lakes and river. So basically, you're looking at 2 bodies of water that are funded in terms of progress that can be achieved. One between Commerce and I-30, that's about 14.5 acres, and a smaller one between Commerce and the railroad tracks, which is about 8.5 acres. And one of the big proposals was to, in fact, channelize, have 2 channels between the two. This would be shallow water channels, not more than 18 inches, 2 feet, and narrow, so you're not compromising the foundations of these bridges. And that gives you the appearance that, in fact, in real terms, the water is flowing from one body to the other body. We then thought of adding a 3rd lake so that you would have even more idea of continuity between the water bodies. And we're going to have to study how to make that lake happen. The 2 lakes that I showed previously would be fed by groundwater, pumped from the ground. And this one would have to be fed either by the river or by stormwater. So that's something that needs to be looked at more. But the basic thrust of this, I think we get the idea, is how do you begin to implement the idea that there's waterfront on the downtown side, that dream lake that was talked about. So if you begin to look at the whole of it in terms of the amenities that you can put here, and much of this is permanent amenities, amenities that you can put now, such as a big promenade that would be about 1 mile long, that can be implemented exactly as is planned on the Balanced Vision Plan. So this is no temporary thing. This would be a permanent thing. We can do that. And I will sort of take you around this kind of environment. And I think you've seen some of these pictures. Clearly, the funds right now focus on these two things, but I think we can improve on that as we go along. So this is a view from the Commerce Street Bridge. It's a bit distorted because it's a wide-angle view. The river on the side, the jail, and you see the Tower of Reunion there, looking south towards the I-30 bridge. And this is what the actual lake geometry would look like in that environment. The lake would be dug to about 10 feet deep. You can see one of the channels on the left side creating a bit of an island before the other channel, and the new arches for the Margaret Hunt Hill Bridge. So it's very feasible to do this today. We're showing a guy sliding on a zip line there. Might be kind of cool to get on the levee and zip down to the park. And we've put a lot of attention with Brad and Diana. We were walking underneath the Commerce Street Bridge. You see it there. And it's really amazing if you haven't had the opportunity, even without any improvements whatsoever. Shade, coolness, breeze, great views of the skyline, readily accessible. And so we're trying to make the most of that. And so if you were to place the excavation on the left there of the lake, you place a promenade, you already have a ramp down going to what would be the service maintenance road for the levees. You don't have to do much on the levees. You focus down on the floodway itself with new trees and vegetation. And by the way, I've read articles recently about the questioning the trees, that you can't put trees on the floodway because the Army Corps would say no. Well, they are in fact a necessity. It's a need to have trees for a very simple reason, is that when you put lakes on a floodway, the coefficient of resistance of flood waters, when you get a flood, they tend to move much faster over a slick surface like a standing water lake than they would on the meadow that's there today. So how do you slow the water down? You can't have just speeding up flood racing down to the Trinity Forest and wreaking havoc there or beyond. You have to restrain and create friction on the floodplain to do that. And friction is what trees do. So anyone that thinks that trees are not permissible, they are a necessity. And hydrologic models have been done by CH2M Hill to the satisfaction of the Corps of Engineers that this is in fact what needs to happen. And we've put more than 19,000 trees in this floodway in terms of the design for that purpose. Of course, we tried to make the trees happen also for recreation, environment, habitat, and so forth. But the focus is on that area underneath Commerce Street. And I hope you can understand the plan. I mean, you're looking at the columns that support the Commerce Street Bridge. You can see them, I think, there and there. So these little strikes are the supports of the bridge. The bridge has been rendered transparent so you can see down below. You're looking at the downtown side of the levee here. So there's actually existing access that you can get on top of the levee here that might be used for parking. The river is in its current location, and you're looking to the lower right to the larger lake, and then to the upper right to the smaller lake. There's a proposal for a water maze and a spray park. There could be boat rentals, a beer garden, picnic groves. This is the environment of that bridge. And there's already an active art community that puts out these wonderful kind of figures. I think art is a necessity in these kinds of environments, and you can clearly imagine that this could be what we call a pop-up park. It pops up. You can help it to go along, but you don't need to do much infrastructure to do this. Put some paving down, bring some water pipes, there's already water on the bridge underneath, and let people have at it. Here we're being more colorful perhaps than that, maybe adding a climbing wall. So what do you do when the floods come? You pick up and go. You take your food trucks out, you drive them off, pick up your chairs in a van and take them off, and flood waters can just run through. This is remarkable because this is kind of a state of the art in terms of urban design. Pop-up parks and temporary kind of urbanism is all over the place. Here's an example which is remarkably the same scale as what I've shown you. This is the parking lot that you see on the upper left for the Philadelphia Art Museum in what is called the oval, which is the roads that encircle the space. Well, for summer, they simply repave or paint, if you will, the parking lot. They move the cars out, and they produce the scene you see on the upper right. And you get the idea. This is very low cost. And you have the food tables, the food trucks, chairs, you have a small little spray park. And on the sides, you actually have a beer garden, and people kind of picnic, and it's been a gigantic success. There's no reason why that cannot exist here. In fact, the area that I've just talked about in that plan is about the area of Clyde Warren Park. It's about 4.5 acres. You could have a Trinity equivalent of the Clyde Warren Park in context of the Commerce Street Bridge and be a complete sensation for very little investment, surrounded by water. There's also the possibility of bringing one of Brad's council circle proposals to a corner of the lake that would look at the downtown skyline. And the idea of the council circles in terms of stone is that when the lakes become expanded in years to come, as the balanced vision plan gets implemented, you can pick them up and go and put them somewhere else. So you can do things that are, quote, temporary but permanent at the same time. And that's the idea of the water maze that is already part of the balanced vision plan, as you see right there. So you can build this and actually start putting blocks that are permanent that build towards the ultimate plan. And the idea is that the water from the lakes that feeds the lakes would come into this channelized cross-section, so become infrastructural at the same time. This is the view from of the Commerce Street Bridge looking towards the north, and the Margaret Hunt Hill Bridge happened to be a train rolling at the time. Kind of interesting to be in a place where you see trains. And that is what the lake would look like with the water maze in front of it and the service road behind it, and we're bringing vehicular parking coming off of the Sylvan Bridge and the ramp that's been created there to bring you down. We were requested to show what the parkway would do to this image, and that's what it would do. There's been some critique of this image because it shows the parkway as being 4 lanes instead of 6, but the fact is that in this area it is 4 lanes. It grows to 6 in other areas, but not here. And this image actually reflects the design guidelines that were put forth for the parkway that includes planted on the medians and green walls and things of that sort. Here you see a view towards the south, and that's the flood wall of the parkway that you see there below the jail. All this to say that the plans for the Balanced Vision Plan and the plans that we're proposing now were done knowing that the parkway might exist there one day. So it doesn't compromise the level of amenities that are being planned in the lakes area. This just to illustrate how the parkway fits in the context of the promenade, which is that wiggly white line, and the proposed lakes. And this to show the red line in terms of potential vehicular access that would come down from the Sylvan Bridge to feed these lakes, if you will. Other ideas have to do in terms of building more permanent amenities. There's a concept of a very large pavilion that could be relocated as a permanent feature, and a fixed bridge that could also be relocated to a permanent location where the river today coincides with the river in its future meandered state. So it doesn't mean that you have to move the river to be able to get from one side to the other. That's just an image that you've seen before of what that pavilion might look like. And it's been submitted already to the Corps of Engineers in terms of a design. And when the record of decision comes, and this is part of that record. So you don't have to start redesigning things to build amenities that might be there long term. This is a very interesting area. This is between Continental Bridge on the left and Margaret Hunt Hill. I mean, there's a big expanse of grass there. This happened to be on the dedication day of the Continental Bridge, and they had food trucks and tents and games and so forth. And it's an area that, because of access, I mean, could be a wonderful play area. You could have movable BMX tracks that they have designed in other places. You could have a synthetic ice place for skating and so forth. And at night, of course, you can light it all up with the bridges. So these are places that are opportunity areas to do something while the balanced vision plan in its entirety gets implemented. But, frankly, they could be quite interesting because of the energy that's concentrated here already between Trinity Groves, Continental Bridge, and Margaret Hunt Hill. You could bring your kayak and take that path all the way to the water. And further to the south, you're looking at Continental Bridge here, Margaret Hunt Hill, the railroad track. This is the Oak Cliff side. And we thought of bringing in disc golf, championship caliber, so that you can actually get on the levee and just toss the thing. And you can fit a pretty cool course, unique. I mean, you'd have to thread the frisbee through the railroad track, aim between the piers. And then further south, we have this idea of enhancing an existing wetland to create more of a nature play environment with more meadows, more wildflowers. And that's where we are proposing what we call a swing bridge. The swing bridge could be something transportable. 2 columns, 2 equal parts in a V shape, just for pedestrians. And when the floods come, the floodwaters can open the bridge and let the floods through. So you can do things that are permanent in a temporary way or temporary in a permanent way. I'm not sure which is the correct way to do that. And this is a view that would be transformed into that. There's that guy again on the zip line. I like this view because it suggests this kind of environment. This was the Trinity River back in 1918. You can see how beautiful, bountiful it is. And this is to say that one of the things I talk about in my book is that the memory of the foundational landscape of cities, that landscape which is the foundation of a city. And of course, Dallas was founded just here, on this river. It's an integral part of an urban ecology, meaning the idea of the mind and the memory of the mind, of that landscape, becomes an ecological concern, not just from a nature point of view, but from a human point of view. So the marriage of humanity to ecology and nature become all connected. And it reminds me, in a way, of the idea of Tao, the idea of Feng Shui, and what that has to do with that which we hold so dear in ways that perhaps we don't understand. I like this image because it's the Manhattan project that was done by 2 academics that suggested to imagine New York City before it was New York City. You had this bountiful forest of the Hudson River, and they did all the ecological investigations to find out where were the streams and all these kinds of things. It's just beautiful. Of course, they've lost it. You don't. It's here. You can have it. You can have that vision of this great memory of a landscape that was foundational in the context of this city that's growing by leaps and bounds. What's interesting about the Trinity River as a whole, if you look at the disposition of uses on the ground, more than 2,000 acres, 3 times the size of Central Park, more than 73% of the land area is in natural state, enhanced. And that's pretty significant. And if you look at simply the ecological impact of the 19,000 trees I talked about in terms of carbon sequestration, for example, it's pretty substantial. And if you add the 300 acres of wetland that's being proposed, it's a huge sink for carbon. So this Trinity corridor is more than simply a question of memory. It folds green infrastructure as a major derivative that makes the city needed, not just wanted. There it is in the context of the region. I don't know if you can see this, but it seems small. There it is. That's 9 miles. But its power is huge. By my own estimation, and I suspect it can be challenged, there's about 1,000 acres of land, within half mile of the river that's undergoing already a lot of redevelopment. So this is the force of this project, bringing people back in. And if you were to assume a transfer of densities from about 0.3 floor area ratio to about 3 floor area ratio, which is what you might expect, say, projects from West Town height to a normal suburban subdivision, you could put a population of 100,000 people here without batting an eye. And this is the place where transit converges. This is the place where streetcars are being planned, where bikeways are being planned, connections all the way to White Rock Lake and Coombs Creek and so forth. So if you begin to think of the people that might live within a few blocks of those trails that could come in here, it's in the hundreds of thousands of people. And these are the people that are going to make Dallas be what it is in the future. So not doing this comes at a big price. You can begin to see the connection of proposed development. This is the work of Shop and Stoss for this connectivity thing. You can begin to see the push towards the edge. This is the West Dallas folks. So it's really hard to imagine how 33 acres of water can do so much. And with this I conclude, because I am convinced that this is not a want but a real need. Thank you.